Welcome to my channel, Welcome to that channel.
The killer at Heather Festival, a Hamish Macbeth mystery. Morning drifted into Lochdu, the way mist drifted down from the hills. Without haste, and without asking anyone's permission, the sea loch lay as smooth as polished slate beneath a pale Highland sky. Thin ribbons of cloud clung to the mountains, while the first hints of autumn painted the distant heather in bruised shades of purple. A damp wind wandered through the village, rattling hanging baskets, and making the gulls complain as if they had been personally insulted by the weather. It promised rain. It always promised rain. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth considered this one of Scotland's greatest virtues. Rain discouraged visitors. He stood on the little stone bridge with a fishing rod balanced against his shoulder, gazing thoughtfully into the river. Officially, he was checking for illegal salmon poachers. Unofficially, he was wondering whether anyone would notice if he became one himself. Towser, his shaggy dog, sat patiently beside him, with the air of a philosopher contemplating the meaning of breakfast. "You'll no be tellin'," Hamish murmured. Towser yawned. Hamish took that as agreement. His radio crackled unexpectedly. "Macbeth!" The voice of headquarters burst from the speaker with all the friendliness of an incoming artillery shell. Hamish looked at the radio. The radio looked back. Or at least it seemed to. Perhaps, he reflected, batteries died unexpectedly every day. He switched the volume down. There were advantages to living several hours from Strathbane. Radio reception often became mysteriously unreliable whenever paperwork threatened. He leaned against the bridge rail and watched the water instead. Life in Lochdu generally rewarded patience. Nothing much happened. That was exactly how Hamish liked it. People from the cities imagined police work involved dramatic chases, gunfire, and flashing lights. They had clearly never tried persuading old Angus MacLean that his neighbour's sheep had not deliberately insulted him. Hamish had once spent an entire afternoon mediating a dispute over a goose. The goose had won. He smiled faintly at the memory. Behind him, the village slowly awakened. Mrs. Wellington opened the curtains of the hotel dining room. The smell of frying bacon drifted into the cool air. Someone unloaded crates outside Patel's village shop. A tractor coughed somewhere beyond the cottages. It was, Hamish decided, shaping into a nearly perfect day, which naturally meant someone would ruin it. The annual Heather Festival always brought outsiders. Lochdu tolerated tourists much as elderly cats tolerated energetic children, politely, briefly, with the constant hope they would eventually go away. The festival committee had decorated the village square with purple bunting that fluttered uncertainly in the breeze. Tables were being erected for baking competitions, pipe bands were due by noon, and several elderly ladies had already begun arguing over whose shortbread recipe represented authentic Highland tradition. The answer changed depending on who was listening. Hamish wandered toward the hotel, deciding that coffee was more urgent than law enforcement. Inside, the dining room glowed with warmth. Mrs. Wellington poured him an enormous mug before he had even spoken. "You've that hungry look." "I've always that hungry look." "True enough." She added another sausage to his plate. Hamish regarded her affectionately. Hospitality in the Highlands rarely required explanations. He had just begun attacking the breakfast when the front door burst open. Conversation stopped. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Even Towser looked up. A gleaming black Range Rover rolled into the village square like a battleship entering a fishing harbour. Its polished paint reflected the cottages so perfectly that they appeared embarrassed by association. The driver climbed out. He was tall, expensively dressed, and spectacularly pleased with himself. His camel overcoat probably cost more than Hamish earned in several months. His shoes had never encountered mud. His smile suggested he expected applause simply for existing. The stranger removed designer sunglasses with theatrical precision and surveyed Lochdu as though considering improvements. Nobody smiled back. Mrs. Wellington sniffed. English! One could not have identified the nationality from appearance alone. It was the manner, the confidence, the assumption that everywhere else was merely waiting for London to arrive. The newcomer marched into the hotel carrying a leather briefcase. "Good morning," he announced. Silence answered him. "I said good morning." Several villagers eventually murmured greetings. He seemed disappointed they had not stood. "I've booked the best suite." Mrs. Wellington consulted her register. "You've booked room 4. I specifically requested the finest accommodation." "It is." He looked around the modest dining room. The website was selective. "It usually is." Hamish continued eating. The stranger noticed him. "You the local policeman?" "Aye." "Excellent." There was something alarming about anyone who considered the local policeman excellent news. The man held out an immaculate hand. "Rupert Channing." Hamish shook it. The grip was firm in the manner favored by men who read books about leadership. "I'm Hamish Macbeth." "Ah, yes." Rupert looked him up and down. "You don't seem particularly busy." Hamish glanced at his breakfast. "No, just now. I expect I'll require your assistance. I'm sure you'll survive." Rupert blinked. People unused to Highland conversations often mistook them for misunderstandings. "I'm organizing the Heather Festival." Mrs. Wellington frowned. "No, you're no. I've purchased the sponsorship rights." "You've what?" The festival required modernization. The room became very quiet. Hamish continued buttering toast. Rupert seemed oblivious. "I run a successful event management company in Surrey." Nobody appeared impressed. "The festival has enormous commercial potential. I've invited journalists, television crews, and several celebrities." Old Donald Morrison slowly lowered his newspaper. "We've managed 83 festivals without celebrities." "Exactly my point." Rupert smiled broadly. "They've been amateur." Hamish saw several villagers exchange glances. He recognized those glances. The Highlands possessed countless methods of expressing hostility. Silence ranked among the deadliest. Rupert continued enthusiastically. "We're replacing the traditional sea lid with a laser light display." Mrs. Wellington dropped a spoon. "We're doing what?" "And the piping competition has been shortened." A gasp traveled around the room. "There'll also be gourmet fusion cuisine instead of local food." Now someone actually groaned. Rupert misunderstood entirely. "I knew you'd appreciate fresh ideas." Hamish took another sip of coffee. This man, he reflected, had accomplished something remarkable. In less than 5 minutes he had offended nearly every resident of Lockdow. That required genuine talent. Later that morning, Hamish strolled through the village with Towser padding faithfully behind. Rupert Channing was already issuing instructions. "No, no, no," he barked at volunteers. "Those flowers are completely wrong. They've always been there," one woman replied. "They look provincial." "We are provincial. Precisely the image we're changing." He ordered banners moved. He criticized the flower displays. He informed the pipe band that tartan looked rather dated. Hamish paused outside Patel's shop. Mr. Patel emerged carrying a box of vegetables. "He will not last." "No?" "The ladies of the church committee have begun smiling." Hamish looked across the square. Sure enough, 3 elderly women watched Rupert with expressions of perfect sweetness. That was ominous. "How long?" Mr. Patel considered. "Perhaps 2 days." Hamish nodded. "A generous estimate." Rupert now argued with the chairman of the fishing competition. "You can't simply catch fish. We've always caught fish. There needs to be branding. They're trout. They need logos." The chairman stared. "So do you." Hamish quietly rescued a sack of potatoes from falling off Patel's trolley. "Visitors," Patel sighed. "They mean well." "No," said Hamish thoughtfully. "This one doesn't." He watched Rupert speaking into an expensive mobile phone. The outsider laughed loudly. He pointed at cottages as if discussing redevelopment. He never once noticed the expressions surrounding him. That, Hamish knew, was the dangerous sort of blindness. People who ignored the feelings of others often assumed they had no consequences. The Highlands disagreed. Clouds gathered above the mountains. A cold wind swept down the glen. The first drops of rain darkened the dusty road. Rupert looked upward with annoyance. Typical. Hamish smiled to himself. The weather, unlike event managers, had never cared about schedules. Towser gave a soft whine. Hamish scratched the dog's ears. "Aye," he said quietly. "Something tells me life's about to become complicated." Towser looked toward Rupert Channing. For just a moment, the dog growled. Hamish rarely ignored Towser's instincts. He watched the Englishman disappear into the hotel, still talking loudly into his telephone while the villagers silently returned to their work. Above Lockdow, thunder rolled faintly among the hills. The Heather Festival had not yet begun. Already someone had made enough enemies to fill the village hall. Rain arrived in earnest before noon, sweeping across the loch in silver sheets that blurred the mountains into ghostly shapes. The festival committee scrambled to rescue tables and bunting, while Rupert Channing stood beneath the hotel's porch, complaining loudly that the weather had not been mentioned in the promotional material. Hamish, carrying 2 folding chairs under one arm and an umbrella that had long since surrendered to the Highland wind, watched with mild amusement. "You can't possibly hold an outdoor festival in this," Rupert declared. Mrs. Wellington looked at him as though he had announced that water was unexpectedly wet. "We've held it in worse. I'll speak to whoever's in charge." "I?" "Yes. There must be someone responsible." "There is." "Excellent." Mrs. Wellington pointed toward the grey sky. "The Almighty." Rupert opened his mouth, thought better of arguing with heaven itself, and slammed the hotel door behind him. Hamish carried the rescued chairs into the village hall, where a dozen volunteers had gathered around kettles of boiling tea and trays of freshly baked scones. Rain drummed steadily on the slate roof. Inside, conversation flowed as naturally as the weather outside. "Did ye hear?" whispered Jessie Curry, the postmistress. "Hear what?" asked Hamish, helping himself to a scone before anyone else could. He offered young Davy £200 to wear one of those ridiculous costumes. What costume? A giant purple heather flower. Hamish nearly choked on his tea. Did Davy accept? He told the fellow precisely where he could plant the costume. Old Angus MacLean snorted. "I've never liked English businessmen." "You've never liked anybody," observed Jessie. "Aye." Angus considered the point. Still true. The room filled with gentle laughter. Hamish said very little. He had long ago discovered that silence encouraged people to fill it. Sure enough, Jessie leaned closer. "They say Mr. Channing has bought the old Macpherson Lodge." Hamish looked up. "The empty hunting lodge. The very one. I thought nobody wanted it. Apparently he plans to turn it into some luxury retreat." Angus muttered darkly into his tea. "With hot tubs." There was genuine horror in his voice. "Hot tubs," Hamish repeated. "So they say." "Where?" Looking over the loch, Hamish winced. "That's a pity." The Highlands had survived Vikings, Jacobite rebellions, and generations of stubborn lairds. Whether they would survive luxury wellness retreats remained an open question. Jessie lowered her voice again. "There's more. There usually is. I delivered 3 registered letters to him this morning, and 3 different names on the envelopes." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "Business? Perhaps." But he looked worried. How worried? He locked himself in his room before opening them. That was interesting. Not important. Not yet. But interesting. Hamish tucked the detail away in the quiet corners of his mind where small observations often sat until they found companions. Outside, the rain eased. Festival preparations resumed with reluctant determination. Children splashed through puddles while volunteers rehung damp bunting. Somewhere a piper stubbornly practiced despite the weather, the notes drifting over the loch like mournful seabirds. Rupert emerged from the hotel carrying a clipboard. He immediately began criticizing everything. "The stalls are uneven." "They're on grass," one volunteer replied. "The banners aren't symmetrical." "The wind moved them." "Well, stop the wind." Nobody answered. Hamish wandered across the square with Towser trotting faithfully behind. Rupert spotted him. "Constable." "I've had something stolen." "So soon?" "My imported coffee machine." Hamish blinked. "You brought a coffee machine?" "It cost nearly £3,000. To Lockdow?" "I don't drink instant." Hamish looked thoughtfully toward the mountains. "No. I demand you investigate." "When did you last see it?" "This morning." "And where was it?" "My suite." "Door locked?" "Of course." "Window?" "Closed." Rupert folded his arms impatiently. "Well? It'll likely turn up." "That's your professional opinion?" "It often is." Rupert stared in disbelief. "I expected fingerprints." Hamish smiled faintly. "I expected rain." Towser wandered into the hotel, entirely ignoring both men. Rupert threw up his hands. "I've dealt with police forces across Europe." "I'm sorry to hear that." Before Rupert could formulate a suitably outraged response, Towser returned carrying something triumphantly in his mouth. It was a polished leather shoe. Only one. Rupert's expression darkened. "My Italian loafer." Towser wagged his tail proudly. Mrs. Wellington appeared in the doorway. "I told ye not to leave shoes outside your room." "I did no such thing." "Then explain why the dog found it in the corridor." Rupert snatched the shoe away. "This village is impossible." "No," Mrs. Wellington replied. "It's simply no use to folk who think shoes are more important than common sense." Rupert stalked away muttering about incompetence. Hamish watched him disappear upstairs. Towser sneezed. "Good work," Hamish murmured. The dog looked pleased, despite having solved only the mystery of the missing shoe. By late afternoon the village had regained its rhythm. The rain cleared entirely, leaving the hills glowing emerald beneath a low golden sun. Wisps of mist curled from the forests, and the air smelled of wet earth and peat smoke. Visitors began arriving for the festival. Cars lined the narrow road into Lockdow. Artists unpacked paintings of Highland landscapes. Craftsmen arranged carved walking sticks, wool blankets and silver jewelry. A television crew erected cameras near the village green while Rupert hovered around them with the unmistakable eagerness of a man who expected to become famous before supper. Hamish avoided the excitement by climbing the path overlooking the harbour. From there he could see almost everything. The hotel, The square, the boats rocking gently below. People behaved differently when they believed no one was paying attention. Rupert certainly did. He was no longer smiling. Instead, he stood beside the old war memorial, speaking sharply with a woman Hamish had not seen before. She was perhaps in her early 40s, elegantly dressed despite the muddy ground, with dark hair tucked beneath a cream hat. Unlike Rupert, she kept her voice low, too low to hear. Hamish watched from the hillside. Rupert thrust a folded envelope toward her. She refused to take it. He grabbed her wrist. She pulled free with surprising force. For a brief moment, both forgot where they were. Their expressions changed. Rupert's confidence vanished. The woman looked genuinely frightened. Then she noticed someone approaching along the road. Instantly, both stepped apart. Rupert slipped the envelope into his pocket. The woman walked quickly toward the harbor without looking back. Hamish remained perfectly still. Towser, beside him, pricked his ears. Hamish said softly. He had seen enough arguments to recognize one when he found it. But this had not looked like lovers quarreling, nor business partners disagreeing. It had looked disturbingly like one person trying to silence another. He descended the hill at his usual unhurried pace. There was no point rushing. People revealed more by believing they'd gone unnoticed. As he reached the village square, Elspeth Grant climbed out of a small blue car, camera slung over one shoulder, and notebook already in hand. The reporter from the Highland Times smiled when she spotted him. "Hello, Hamish. You're here for the festival? And whatever trouble usually follows you. I'm hoping for a quiet weekend." She laughed. "When have you ever had one?" Hamish looked across the square toward the hotel. Rupert Channing had recovered his broad public smile, and was shaking hands with television presenters as though nothing unpleasant had happened minutes earlier. Only Hamish knew otherwise. And somewhere in Rupert's pocket rested a folded envelope that another person had been unwilling, even frightened, to accept. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of distant rain. Towser gave another low growl. This time Hamish found himself agreeing with the dog. Something had come to Lockdow with Rupert Channing. Something that had nothing to do with festivals, sponsorships, or luxury hotels. Whatever it was beginning to cast a longer shadow than the gathering evening. Evening settled over Lockdow with deceptive gentleness. The rain clouds had broken apart, leaving long streaks of crimson and gold across the western sky. Smoke rose from cottage chimneys. Fishing boats rocked lazily against the pier, and the village prepared for the opening supper of the Heather Festival. To anyone arriving for the first time, it looked like a place where nothing truly dreadful could ever happen. Hamish Macbeth knew better. He stood outside the police station feeding Towser the last piece of a meat pie, while pretending to study a notice about lost sheep. In reality, he was watching Rupert Channing through the hotel window across the square. Rupert was entertaining guests with the polished ease of a television presenter. His laughter carried through the open windows, a shade too loud to sound genuine. Every few minutes his hand drifted unconsciously toward the inside pocket of his expensive jacket, the same pocket that held the folded envelope Hamish had seen earlier. People only checked for two things that often: money or trouble. Towser swallowed the last bite and nudged Hamish's hand for more. "Greedy beast," Hamish murmured. The dog wagged his tail without the slightest sign of shame. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "If you stare much longer," Elspeth Grant said, joining him with her camera hanging around her neck, "people will think you're actually working. I've a reputation to protect. Your reputation is that you avoid work whenever possible." Hamish smiled. "Then it's important no one discovers I've been observing folk." They walked slowly toward the harbor, where the festival committee had arranged lanterns along the waterfront. Their reflections shimmered on the dark water, disturbed only by the occasional leap of a fish. Elspeth glanced sideways at him. "What's bothering you? Who says anything is? You've been pretending to admire fishing boats for nearly 20 minutes. I'm very interested in boats." "No, you're interested in Rupert Channing." Hamish gave a small shrug. "What do you know about him?" "I did a little homework before driving north." "Reporter," Hamish sighed. "It's a respectable profession." "So they keep saying." Elspeth ignored him. "His company has organized luxury festivals all over England. So several local councils ended up arguing with him afterward. About money. Sometimes. What else?" She hesitated. "There were rumors." "What sort?" "Nothing I could print." Hamish looked out across the loch, meaning. People claimed he bullied business partners, sued competitors, bought properties that mysteriously became much cheaper after the owners suffered financial problems. Proof? None. That was often the difficulty. Gossip was plentiful. Facts were rarer. Still, gossip usually began somewhere. They reached the end of the pier. An elderly fisherman named Archie Campbell sat repairing lobster pots beneath a lantern. He nodded as they approached. "Evening, Hamish." "Evening, Archie." Archie tied another knot before speaking again. "Your English gentleman came asking questions." "What sort of questions?" "About the old lighthouse." Hamish frowned. "What about it?" "Wanted to know who owned the land." "It belongs to the council." "So I told him." Archie spat thoughtfully into the sea. He seemed disappointed. "Did he say why?" "No." Archie looked up with clear blue eyes that had watched the loch for more than 70 years. But he wasn't asking like a tourist. How was he asking? Like a man counting money. Hamish thanked him, though he wasn't entirely sure why the information mattered. The old lighthouse had stood empty for decades. Nobody wanted it, unless they intended to build something around it. He tucked the thought away beside Jessie's story about the hunting lodge. Rupert Channing, it seemed, had developed an unusual interest in Loch Dubh's neglected places. As they turned back toward the village, a sharp voice echoed across the square. "You've lied to me." Every head turned. Rupert Channing stood outside the hotel facing a broad-shouldered man in an expensive tweed jacket. The newcomer had arrived in a silver Jaguar only minutes before. Unlike Rupert, he made no attempt to keep his anger private. "I've had enough of your promises." Rupert forced a smile. "Not here. I'll say it wherever I please." Festival visitors slowed to watch. Mrs. Wellington appeared in the doorway, arms folded. Rupert lowered his voice urgently. "We'll discuss this inside. We've been discussing it for 6 months. I told you the money was coming. You told me many things." The stranger pulled a folder from beneath his arm. "I've brought copies." Rupert's face lost its color. "Put that away." "So there are papers," Elspeth whispered. Hamish nodded almost imperceptibly. "Interesting. Very interesting." Before the argument could continue, Rupert noticed the growing audience. His public smile returned with astonishing speed. "My dear Malcolm," he said loudly. "Always joking." "I am not joking." Rupert laughed anyway, and steered the man firmly toward the hotel entrance. The door closed behind them. The square buzzed immediately with speculation. Highland villages rarely needed newspapers. They produced their own. Elspeth smiled. "Half the village will know about that by breakfast." They knew before the door shut. Hamish's eyes remained on the hotel windows. Curtains twitched upstairs. Someone was watching. Not Mrs. Wellington. Someone else. A pale face disappeared almost as soon as he noticed it. "Did you see?" "Yes," Elspeth said quietly. "The woman from this afternoon." "I think so." Neither spoke for a moment. The festival band began tuning their pipes in the distance, filling the evening air with melancholy notes that drifted across the water. The music should have sounded festive. Instead, for reasons Hamish could not explain, it carried an edge of warning. He had learned to trust such feelings. Years of policing in the Highlands had taught him that murder rarely arrived without first sending quieter messengers. A frightened woman, a concealed letter, an angry business associate, too many secrets gathering beneath one respectable smile. Hamish slipped his hands into his pockets. "Come on, Towser." The dog fell into step beside him. "Where are we going?" Elspeth asked. "Home." "I thought you were investigating." "I've no murder. Not yet." Hamish looked back once at the warmly lit hotel. Inside, Rupert Channing was surrounded by guests, laughter, and expensive whiskey. Outside, the wind had begun to rise again, rustling the purple heather that covered the hills above Loch Dubh. "No," Hamish said quietly, more to himself than to Elspeth. "Not yet." The wind strengthened during the night, driving bands of mist through the glen and setting the hotel sign creaking on its iron brackets. Loch Dubh slept lightly, as Highland villages often did when the weather turned restless. Curtains stirred. Dogs barked at unseen things, and somewhere out on the loch a buoy clanged with slow, lonely regularity. Hamish Macbeth, however, slept as only a man with a clear conscience and an old iron stove could sleep. Towser did not. A low growl rumbled from the dog shortly before dawn. Hamish opened one eye. "What is it now?" Towser was already on his feet, ears pricked toward the front door. The growl became a bark, then another. With a sigh that suggested civilization demanded altogether too much of him, Hamish swung his legs out of bed, pulled on yesterday's trousers, and opened the door. A chilly morning greeted him. So did Jessie Curry, the postmistress. She stood outside wrapped in a heavy wool coat, breathing hard from the uphill walk. "I've been knocking for 5 minutes. I was asleep, I gathered." She glanced past him at Towser. "The dog's got better manners than you. He usually has." Jessie lowered her voice. "I've something you ought to hear." Hamish rubbed the sleep from his eyes. Coffee first. No time. That immediately caught his attention. Nobody in Lockdow willingly postponed coffee unless something genuinely unusual had happened. Jessie stepped inside while Hamish put the kettle on. "I was sorting the early mail," she began, "when I remembered something about yesterday." "Those registered letters for Rupert Channing. What about them? They weren't all delivered." Hamish turned from the stove. "I thought you said 3. "I did. I handed over 2. You forgot one." Jessie looked offended. "I've never forgotten a registered letter in 32 years. So, he refused to sign for the 3rd. Hamish frowned. Refused. He looked at the sender's name and said he wasn't accepting it. "Did you happen to notice the sender?" Jessie nodded. "It came from Edinburgh, and the envelope carried the name of a firm of solicitors. That was worth remembering. People declined letters from lawyers for many reasons. Few of them were cheerful." The kettle began to whistle. Hamish poured 2 mugs of strong coffee and handed one to Jessie. "What happened to the letter?" "I've still got it." "You've brought it?" "No." She looked scandalized. "I'm not committing a federal crime. We don't have federal crimes. Whatever sort they are." Hamish smiled. "I merely wondered." Jessie relaxed a little. "I thought perhaps you'd ask Rupert about it." "I might. If you're feeling energetic." "I'm trying to avoid that." She laughed, finished her coffee in 3 determined gulps, and left for the post office. Hamish watched her disappear down the road. Towser sat beside him. "Lawyers," Hamish muttered. The dog sneezed. "Exactly." The village awoke beneath a sky washed clean by the night's rain. Heather glistened on the hillsides. The sea sparkled blue enough to fool visitors into believing Scotland enjoyed warm weather. Festival Day had officially begun. Stalls lined the village square, displaying knitted scarves, carved walking sticks, homemade jam, and bottles of heather honey. The smell of fresh bread mingled with peat smoke and frying bacon. Children raced between the tents carrying paper flags. Pipe bands tuned their instruments. Visitors smiled. Highlanders prepared themselves to endure them. Rupert Channing strode through the square with the confidence of a victorious general inspecting conquered territory. He wore an expensive tweed jacket that looked as though it had never been within 50 miles of actual countryside. Behind him walked 2 young assistants carrying clipboards. "Move those flower pots. They're blocking the camera angle. And someone find me the mayor." "We don't have one," said Mrs. Wellington, passing with a tray of scones. Rupert stopped. "What? We've no mayor. Every village has a mayor." "No. Then who's in charge?" Mrs. Wellington, passing with a tray of scones. Rupert stopped. "What? We've no mayor. Every village has a mayor." Wellington considered. "Depends what day it is." Rupert looked as though he suspected everyone was making fun of him. He was right. Hamish wandered into the square carrying a mug of coffee. Rupert immediately intercepted him. "Constable." "I need security." "For what?" "My keynote speech." Hamish glanced around. Half the audience consisted of pensioners discussing marmalade. The other half were children trying to catch a wandering goose. Against whom? The public. Hamish sipped his coffee. "They seem fairly peaceful. They've been glaring at me. They're Highlanders." "Exactly. They glare at everybody." Rupert did not appear reassured. "I also want someone watching my room." "Why?" "I've important documents." "You've a lock." "I don't trust locks." Rupert leaned closer. "I think someone is trying to frighten me." That interested Hamish far more than the complaint itself. "Why would they?" "I don't know. Has anyone threatened you?" Rupert hesitated just long enough for Hamish to notice. "No." "You thought about that answer?" "I simply resent the question." "That happens." Rupert straightened his jacket. "If anything happens, Constable, I'll hold your department responsible. Our department consists of me. Then I'll hold you responsible." He marched away before Hamish could reply. Towser watched him go, and gave a quiet huff. "I know," Hamish said. "He's tiring." Near midday, the piping competition drew most of the visitors toward the village green. Hamish deliberately stayed on the edge of the crowd. He preferred watching people who believed they weren't being watched. Elspeth appeared carrying her camera. "You've become very popular. I was hoping nobody noticed." She handed him a folded program. "I've been asking questions. And your businessman has left a trail." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "In what sense?" "I spoke to one of the television crew. They've worked with him before. And they said Rupert changes business partners almost as often as shirts." "Why?" "They never seem to remain friends." Hamish nodded slowly. "Anyone mention Malcolm? The man from last night?" "That's him. He owns part of Channing Events." "Still?" Elspeth looked thoughtful. "I'm not entirely sure." Money again. The cameraman said there was some dispute over ownership. Money again. So it seems. Before Hamish could ask another question, shouting erupted near the exhibition tents. Rupert's voice carried across the green. I specifically ordered crystal. A young volunteer looked close to tears. We only have village trophies. Rupert held up a small silver cup between two fingers, as though it were contaminated. This is embarrassing. It belonged to my grandfather. The volunteer replied quietly. Then your grandfather had very low standards. The words had scarcely left Rupert's mouth before silence spread through the crowd. The volunteer's face reddened. Old Angus MacLean took one deliberate step forward. So, his voice was calm. You're insulting dead Highlanders now. Several villagers drifted a little closer. Rupert finally sensed the change. He laughed awkwardly. I meant no offense. Aye, Angus replied. But ye managed it anyway. Hamish moved casually between them, before pride could become violence. Angus, what? The judging starts in 5 minutes. Angus looked at Rupert for another long moment. Then he nodded once. For your sake, Hamish. He walked away. Rupert exhaled sharply. You saw that? I did. He threatened me. No. What would you call it? A warning. That's outrageous. Hamish looked him squarely in the eye. Then perhaps stop giving folk reasons. Rupert opened his mouth but found no answer. For the first time since arriving in Lochdu, he looked uncertain. Not angry. Not arrogant. Simply uneasy. Hamish noticed something else. Rupert's hand drifted once again to the inside pocket of his jacket. The envelope. Still there. Still important. Still troubling him. At that moment, a gust of wind swept through the square. A folded sheet of paper slipped from Rupert's pocket and fluttered across the grass before he realized it was gone. He lunged after it. Too late. Towser, delighted by this unexpected game, bounded forward and caught the paper neatly in his mouth. The crowd laughed. Rupert did not. He rushed toward the dog, with a desperation entirely out of proportion to a loose piece of paper. Give me that. Towser danced away happily. Hamish whistled once. The dog trotted obediently back to his master and dropped the paper into Hamish's waiting hand. For the briefest instant, before Rupert snatched it away, Hamish's eyes caught a single line printed across the top of the document. Final notice before legal action. Nothing more. Rupert folded the paper so quickly that nobody else had time to read it. His face had turned almost as pale as the morning mist. I'll take that. Hamish handed it over without argument. There ye are. Rupert forced a smile that convinced no one. Private business, I'm sure. Rupert hurried away toward the hotel without another word. Elspeth watched him disappear. Well? Hamish stared after the retreating figure. He's frightened. Of being sued? No. Hamish slowly shook his head. A lawsuit worries a man. He looked toward the hotel where Rupert vanished inside, locking the door behind him. But something else is terrifying him. The afternoon sun lingered over Lochdu with surprising generosity, drying the rain-soaked grass until the village green buzzed once more with festival life. Children competed in sack races. Elderly ladies judged jars of marmalade with solemn concentration, and the skirl of bagpipes echoed from the hills. To most visitors, the Heather Festival had found its rhythm. To Hamish Macbeth, it felt as though everyone was performing on a stage, while something unpleasant waited just behind the curtain. He wandered without apparent purpose, pausing wherever someone offered him tea or a sandwich. Blair would have called it idling. Hamish preferred to think of it as giving people the opportunity to talk. They rarely disappointed him. Mrs. Wellington intercepted him outside the hotel, with a plate piled high with warm fruit scones. You've not eaten enough. I've had breakfast. Hours ago. She pushed the plate into his hands. And stop pretending you're not listening. Hamish smiled. Listening to what? The guests. He carried the scones to a bench overlooking the square. What about them? Mrs. Wellington glanced toward the hotel before lowering her voice. Mr. Channing has had visitors all day. I've noticed one. There were 3. A gentleman before lunch. Malcolm. Aye. Then a woman with dark hair. The one in the cream hat. Mrs. Wellington looked surprised. So you've seen her, only briefly. And now another man. Hamish looked up. What sort? I'd say solicitor. Why? He carried more papers than luggage. That fitted rather neatly with Jessie's undelivered registered letter. Did you hear any of the conversations? Only shouting. From whom? Mostly Mr. Channing. Mrs. Wellington sniffed. He shouts like a man who's no longer certain people are obeying him. Hamish filed that observation away. It matched what he had already begun to suspect. Rupert wasn't simply unpopular. He was under pressure. The question was from whom? Or perhaps from how many? Towser suddenly lifted his head. The dog's ears twitched. Without warning, he trotted across the square toward the row of exhibition tents. Hamish followed at an unhurried pace. Towser stopped beside the crafts marquee where the elegantly dressed woman from the previous evening stood examining hand-carved walking sticks. She smiled uncertainly as Hamish approached. Friendly dog, he usually knows who's worth meeting. She laughed softly. I'm relieved to hear I passed the test. Hamish removed his cap politely. I don't believe we've met. No. She hesitated. My name is Evelyn Mercer. There was the smallest pause before she spoke her surname, just enough to catch Hamish's attention. Visiting the festival. So I intended. You're staying at the hotel? Only until tomorrow. Towser leaned against her leg, asking for attention. She scratched behind his ears automatically. People often revealed themselves by the way they treated animals. Towser closed his eyes contentedly. Hamish noticed. You've known Mr. Channing long. Her smile faded. A little while. Business? In a manner of speaking. Another careful answer. Not exactly false. Not exactly true. Before Hamish could continue, Rupert emerged from the hotel entrance. The instant he spotted Evelyn, irritation flashed across his face. There you are. She straightened immediately. I was looking at the stalls. I've been searching everywhere. I wasn't aware I needed permission. Rupert forced a laugh upon noticing Hamish. Private conversation. Hamish tipped his cap. I've interrupted enough. As he walked away, he heard Rupert whisper sharply. I told you not to speak to anyone. Hamish kept walking as though he had heard nothing. But he had. Every word. Later that afternoon, Hamish climbed the narrow footpath leading to the old cemetery above the village. It was quiet there. Only the wind moved among the weathered gravestones. From the hilltop he could see almost the entire festival below. People scattered like colored pins across the green. The hotel overlooked everything. So did the abandoned Macpherson Lodge farther along the hillside. He studied it thoughtfully. An expensive property, excellent views, isolated, exactly the sort of place Rupert wanted to develop. Footsteps sounded behind him. It was the minister, Reverend James Wellington, carrying a basket of flowers. Escaping the crowds, for a minute. So am I. The minister arranged fresh flowers beside an old grave before speaking again. Your festival organizer asked me an unusual question. Hamish looked over. What question? He wanted to know whether church records extended back 100 years. Specifically land records. Did you tell him? I told him they're kept in Inverness. The minister smiled faintly. He seemed disappointed. Did he say why he wanted them? No. He paused. But whatever he seeks, he believes it's hidden somewhere around Lochdu. Hamish's gaze drifted toward the old lighthouse, then the abandoned lodge. Land, old records, business disputes, threatening legal notices. It was beginning to resemble pieces of the same puzzle. He simply couldn't yet see the picture. As evening approached, festival organizers prepared for the traditional sealid in the village hall. Rupert had argued for recorded music and elaborate lighting. He had lost. The fiddlers won. Highland tradition generally did. Inside the hall, laughter replaced earlier tensions. Long tables overflowed with stew, oat cakes, smoked salmon and homemade cakes. Hamish accepted a generous bowl of stew and settled near the back wall where nobody expected conversation. Naturally, conversation found him anyway. Old Angus lowered himself onto the bench opposite. I've been thinking. That sounds dangerous. It usually is. Angus spooned stew thoughtfully. That Englishman. Aye? He keeps asking who owns things. So I've heard. Lighthouse, hunting lodge, the old mill. Hamish stopped eating. The mill. Angus nodded. He asked me this morning. What did you tell him? Yeah. That nobody's used it since the 70s. He looked disappointed again. Everything Rupert wanted seemed to involve abandoned properties, not houses, not businesses. Old land, old buildings, old records. Hamish rubbed his chin. Interesting. Very interesting. Then the music stopped. Not gradually, abruptly. Every head turned toward the entrance. Malcolm, the angry business partner, stood in the doorway. His normally ruddy face had gone white. He looked around the crowded hall until he spotted Hamish. Constable. The room fell silent. I need a word. Hamish rose slowly. Outside, the evening had grown cold. What is it? Malcolm glanced toward the hall to make certain nobody could overhear. I've just been to Rupert's room. And he isn't there. People leave rooms. I know. Malcolm swallowed. But his suitcase is open. So are the drawers. Hamish waited. And the legal papers have disappeared. Perhaps he packed them. No. Malcolm looked genuinely uneasy. The window was open. Hamish looked toward the hotel. A light burned in Rupert's upstairs room. Curtains stirred gently in the evening breeze. When did you last see him? About half an hour ago. Where? He said he was meeting someone. Did he say who? No. Where? Malcolm hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, he answered. At the old lighthouse. For the first time all day, Hamish felt a distinct chill that had nothing to do with the Highland wind. The old lighthouse stood nearly a mile beyond the village. Abandoned. Lonely. Far from the cheerful noise of the Heather Festival. It was exactly the sort of place where two people could meet unseen, or where one person could disappear without anyone immediately noticing. Towser, standing beside Hamish, gave a low, uneasy growl. Hamish rested a hand on the dog's head. I think, he said quietly, our peaceful festival may be about to end. The music from the village hall faded behind Hamish as he and Towser set off along the narrow coastal path toward the old lighthouse. The laughter, fiddle tunes and clatter of dancing feet were quickly swallowed by the steady rush of the sea and the whistle of wind through the heather. Malcolm hurried beside him. You think something's happened? I don't know. You don't seem very worried. Hamish kept his eyes on the path. Worry's no much use until ye know what you're worrying about. Malcolm gave an impatient sigh. I've been Rupert's partner for 12 years. So, he wouldn't simply vanish. He always wanted an audience. That, Hamish thought, was probably the truest thing anyone had yet said about Rupert Channing. Towser suddenly darted ahead, nose low to the ground. The path curved around a rocky outcrop before climbing toward the abandoned lighthouse, its whitewashed tower standing against the darkening sky like a lonely sentry. No light had shone from its lantern room for decades. Salt and wind had peeled away much of the paint, and patches of heather grew between the cracked stone steps leading to its door. Hamish slowed. Stay here a minute. Malcolm looked at him in disbelief. Stay? Aye. Why? Because if there's trouble, one frightened man is enough. Before Malcolm could protest, Hamish walked on alone with Towser. The dog stopped halfway up the steps. His ears flattened. A low growl escaped his throat. Hamish crouched beside him. What have you found? Towser sniffed insistently at the ground. There, caught between two stones, lay a broken cufflink. Silver. Expensive. Engraved with the letter C. Hamish picked it up carefully. Not because of fingerprints. He had never placed much faith in dramatic forensic miracles. No. Because broken things often told honest stories. Someone had lost it in a struggle. Or while hurrying. He slipped it into his pocket. The lighthouse door stood slightly open. The wind nudged it back and forth with a slow creak. Hamish stepped inside. The circular room smelled of damp stone, seaweed, and old timber. Nothing appeared disturbed. Dust lay thick across the floor. Except, he knelt. Fresh footprints. Several pairs. One set belonged to heavy boots. Another to narrower dress shoes. A third, smaller. Probably a woman's. Towser sniffed the footprints before wandering toward the spiral staircase. Halfway up the stairs he barked sharply. Hamish followed. The upper room overlooked the sea through cracked windows. It was empty. No Rupert, no Evelyn, no Malcolm, only a folding chair, an old wooden crate, and a whiskey glass, half full, still wet. Hamish touched the side of the glass. Cold. Not recently used. Perhaps an hour, perhaps less. On the crate rested a single sheet of paper. It had been torn roughly in half. The missing portion had been taken away. The remaining words read, Ease, cannot continue, documents, before tomorrow. No signature, no names. Hamish folded the paper and slipped it into his notebook. Towser barked again, this time from the window. Hamish crossed the room. Far below, where the cliff path disappeared into the gathering dusk, he noticed tire marks in the muddy ground. Fresh, very fresh. 2 vehicles had been there. One had turned sharply before driving away. The other had remained longer. Interesting, very interesting. He returned downstairs. Malcolm rushed toward him. Well? Nobody there. What about Rupert? No sign. Malcolm looked both relieved and irritated. So we've wasted our time. Have we? Hamish glanced once more at the tire marks below the cliff. I don't think so. They walked back toward the village in near silence. Night had settled fully over Lockdow. Lanterns glowed warmly in cottage windows. Music floated across the water. Festival fireworks were being prepared near the harbour. It was almost peaceful. Almost. As they reached the hotel, Mrs. Wellington hurried out to meet them. "There you are." "Hmm? A woman came asking for you." "Evelyn? No. Who then? I've never seen her before." "What did she want?" "She wouldn't say." Mrs. Wellington frowned. "But she left this." She handed Hamish a small folded envelope. No stamp. No address. Simply his name written across the front. Hamish opened it. Inside was a single sheet. Only one sentence had been written in neat black ink. "If you wish to prevent murder, stop asking about the land." No signature. No explanation. Malcolm stared at the message. "What does that mean?" Hamish read it again. "I wish I knew." "You think it's genuine?" "I think somebody wanted me to read it." "Shouldn't you tell Blair?" Hamish gave Malcolm a look. Blair would interview the paper, as if summoned by the mention of his name. The unmistakable growl of a large engine echoed from the road leading into Lockdow. Headlights swept across the square. A dark police car rolled to a stop outside the station. The driver's door flew open. Detective Chief Inspector Blair climbed out, already red-faced despite the cool evening. He marched across the square with the expression of a man personally offended by Scotland. "Macbeth!" His voice silenced conversations throughout the village. Hamish waited patiently. Blair stopped inches away. "What in God's name have you been doing?" "Having supper." "You've ignored 3 radio calls." "Reception's poor." "Reception's excellent." "Depends where ye stand." Blair's face darkened another shade. "I've had a complaint." "Only one." "From Rupert Channing." Hamish glanced instinctively toward the hotel. "Oh, he claims you've harassed him, failed to protect his property, insulted him, and refused to investigate a theft." Blair jabbed a finger into Hamish's chest. "The man's an important businessman, so I'm told. And if anything happens to him, Macbeth." Blair leaned even closer. "Your career will be finished." Hamish nodded agreeably. "I'll bear that in mind." Blair stared, momentarily robbed of further insults. He finally snorted. "Where is the fellow now?" Malcolm answered before Hamish could. "We don't know." Blair rounded on him. "What do you mean you don't know?" "He left to meet someone." "When?" "About an hour ago." "Where?" "The old lighthouse." Blair threw his hands into the air. "And nobody thought to report this?" Hamish quietly handed him the anonymous note. Blair read it once, then laughed. "This is rubbish." "It might be. It's someone's idea of a joke." "It could be." Blair thrust the note back. "You villagers always imagine drama." At that exact moment, a terrified scream echoed across the harbour. Every conversation stopped. A young fisherman came running from the direction of the pier, breathless and pale. He pointed toward the water. There's a man." He struggled to catch his breath. "Down by the old festival stage." Blair swore loudly. Hamish did not. He was already moving, Towser racing beside him as the 2 policemen and half the village hurried toward the waterfront. The fireworks, prepared only minutes earlier to celebrate the Heather Festival, remained untouched beside the stage. Their bright-colored boxes stood in eerie contrast to the small crowd beginning to gather near the edge of the pier. Someone lay motionless in the shadows. From where Hamish stood, he could see only one polished shoe protruding beneath the wooden platform, Italian leather. There was no sign of its matching pair. Hamish reached the waterfront several strides ahead of Blair, not because he had run faster, but because Blair had stopped twice to shout contradictory orders at anyone within earshot. "Stand back. No, you, come here. Who touched the body? Don't let anybody leave." The crowd obediently ignored him and looked to Hamish instead. Towser slipped beneath the edge of the festival stage before anyone could stop him. "Towser," Hamish called quietly. The dog halted, gave a single bark, and backed out again. Hamish crouched and ducked beneath the timber platform. The smell reached him first. Not blood. Salt water. Seaweed. Whiskey. The body lay on its side among coils of rope and spare wooden planks. Rupert Channing's expensive tweed jacket was smeared with mud, one sleeve torn at the cuff. His face was turned toward the pilings, hidden from view. Hamish remained perfectly still. There was no hurry now. He noticed details. Rupert's right hand was clenched tightly around a small clump of purple heather. His left wrist still wore an expensive watch. No sign of robbery. His polished shoe remained on one foot. The other foot was covered only by a dark sock. The missing shoe immediately bothered Hamish. People rarely removed a single shoe voluntarily. He leaned closer. A dark bruise spread behind Rupert's right ear. Small, precise. Not the sort of injury caused by simply falling beneath a stage. Hamish backed out into the evening air. Blair pushed past him. Dead? Aye. Blair disappeared underneath for barely 10 seconds before emerging again. Murder. You've decided already? Of course I have. What makes you certain? The man's dead. Hamish said nothing. There was little point arguing before Blair had exhausted himself. The detective glared at the gathering villagers. Nobody moves. Old Angus muttered just loudly enough to be heard. I wasna planning a holiday. Blair rounded on him. You'll keep quiet. Aye. Angus nodded pleasantly. I've been married. I know how. Several villagers hid smiles. Blair became an even deeper shade of crimson. Hamish quietly stepped away from the growing commotion. Noise frightened clues. Silence welcomed them. Towser trotted beside him toward the edge of the pier, where damp footprints marked the weathered boards. The tide had begun to rise. It would soon wash away anything near the waterline. Hamish studied the ground. Many footprints overlapped after the body had been discovered, but farther away, there, a single set of narrow footprints led away from beneath the stage before the crowd had arrived. Women's shoes, small heels. They crossed the harbour path and vanished where the gravel became too hard to hold an impression. Interesting. Very interesting. Macbeth! Blair's voice shattered the quiet. What are you doing now? Looking. I've looked, so I noticed. Blair ignored the remark. I've solved it. So quickly? The business partner. Malcolm? Obviously. Blair smiled with irritating satisfaction. They argued publicly. They did. They met privately. So I've heard. The motive's financial, perhaps. Blair folded his arms triumphantly. There you are. Hamish glanced back toward Rupert's body. I've one question. What? Why would Malcolm remove one shoe? Blair blinked. What shoe? The missing one. Blair stared. For the first time that evening he seemed to realize he had not noticed. It fell off. Maybe. That's settled then. Hamish had known Blair for years. The inspector possessed a remarkable ability to mistake assumptions for evidence. The village hall was transformed into a temporary incident room. Festival banners still hung from the walls above police notebooks and half-finished cups of tea. Visitors whispered nervously. Children were hurried home. The Heather Festival had ended as abruptly as a candle blown out by the wind. Elspeth found Hamish standing beside the kitchen stove. You've seen him? Aye. What do you think? I think he didn't crawl under a stage to die. She almost smiled despite herself. Anything else? He was carrying heather at a heather festival. She waited. Hamish stirred his tea thoughtfully. Fresh heather. So. It had roots. Elspeth frowned. I don't understand. It had just been pulled from the ground. So he fell. No. Hamish looked toward the dark windows. There isn't any growing beneath the stage. Realization dawned across her face. So someone, or something, carried it there. Aye. And he never let go. Before she could ask another question, Blair entered, followed by 2 detectives from Strathbane. He slapped a folder onto the table. We've interviewed Malcolm. And? He lied. He claimed he hadn't seen Channing after 7. Hamish looked up. But a witness saw them arguing outside the lighthouse. Who? A tourist. Hamish nodded slowly. That explained little. Everybody seemed to have argued with Rupert. Blair looked positively delighted. We're arresting Malcolm. So soon? The case is straightforward. Hamish sighed inwardly. Cases that appeared straightforward seldom remained so. An hour later, while Blair loudly questioned Malcolm in the station office, Hamish wandered back toward the harbour. Towser padded faithfully beside him. The tide was almost full. Moonlight shimmered across the loch. The festival stage stood deserted. Hamish crouched near the spot where Rupert's body had been found. Something glinted between 2 damp planks. He reached down carefully. Not another cufflink, a button. Small. Pearl. Definitely from a woman's coat or blouse. He turned it over in his fingers. The thread attached to it had been torn violently. Not cut. Ripped away. Towser sniffed the air, and suddenly pulled toward the end of the pier. What have you found now? The dog stopped beside a rubbish bin. Wedged beneath it lay Rupert's missing shoe. Hamish picked it up. Dry. Completely dry. He frowned. That made no sense. If it had come off during a struggle beneath the stage, it should have been wet from the incoming tide. Instead, someone had placed it there later, deliberately, as though trying to complete the picture after forgetting a detail. He looked back toward the dark harbour. Someone had returned to the scene, not to kill, to tidy. That was always dangerous. Killers often believed they were improving their work. Instead, they merely created fresh mistakes, Hamish slipped the shoe into a paper evidence bag he found in the station's emergency kit. Towser gave a satisfied wag. Good lad. As they walked back toward the police station, Hamish noticed a faint light burning in the upstairs window of the hotel. Only one room remained occupied on that side of the building. Evelyn Mercer's. She stood at the window, staring toward the harbour, not moving, not drawing the curtains, watching. Whether she was grieving, frightened, or waiting for someone, Hamish could not yet tell. But one thing had become increasingly clear. Rupert Channing had not come to Lockdown merely to organize a festival. He had arrived carrying secrets, and now that he was dead, those secrets belonged to someone else. Someone still very much alive, and perhaps desperate enough to kill again before Hamish Macbeth could discover what Rupert had been so afraid of. The following morning dawned cold and brilliantly clear, as though the Highlands had decided that murder was no excuse for untidy weather. Mist drifted across the surface of the loch before slowly lifting into the hills. Gulls wheeled overhead, complaining to one another with great conviction, while the village moved about in subdued silence. The festival bunting still fluttered between the cottages, but no one seemed inclined to take it down. It hung there like an awkward reminder that celebration had given way to suspicion. Hamish arrived at the hotel just after 7. Mrs. Wellington was already setting out breakfast, though there were fewer places laid than usual. "I suppose everyone's cancelled," Hamish said. "Half of them. And the other half? They're staying." "Why?" She poured him coffee. "They want to see what happens." Hamish nodded. Human nature was remarkably consistent. People avoided trouble until it became interesting. "Has Miss Mercer come down?" Mrs. Wellington shook her head. "Not yet." "What about Malcolm?" "Your inspector carted him off before dawn." Blair had wasted no time. He never did when arresting the wrong person. Hamish carried his coffee into the lounge, where Elspeth sat surrounded by notebooks and yesterday's newspapers. "I thought reporters slept late," he said. "We do." "Then why are ye awake?" "Because murders don't respect office hours." She slid a notebook across the table. "I've been making a list." Hamish looked down. It wasn't a list of suspects. It was a list of everyone who had argued with Rupert Channing since arriving in Lockdown. The names covered nearly 2 pages. Hamish smiled despite himself. "That's no helping. It narrows things down. It widens them." Elspeth laughed. "You've a point." Hamish studied the list anyway. Malcolm, Evelyn Mercer, several festival volunteers, the church committee, a television producer, the chairman of the fishing competition, even Angus MacLean. If Blair saw this, Hamish said, he'd arrest the village. He'd need a larger police station. Before either could continue, Jessie Curry burst into the hotel carrying a canvas mailbag. "I've remembered something else." Hamish looked up. "I'm beginning to rely on that sentence." Jessie ignored him. "It's about the solicitor's letter. The one Rupert refused. I checked the register. And? The firm's name wasn't familiar. So, I telephoned Edinburgh." Hamish stared at her. "You did what?" "I was curious." "So ye were. What else is a postmistress supposed to do on a murder morning?" Hamish couldn't argue with that. "What did they tell you?" "They wouldn't discuss their client." "I expected as much. But," Jessie looked immensely pleased with herself, "they did confirm one thing." The letter concerned property. Hamish's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "What sort of property?" "They wouldn't say. But they did ask whether Mr. Channing was still alive." Silence settled over the room. Elspeth slowly closed her notebook. "They didn't know?" Jessie shook her head. The news hadn't reached them. Hamish thanked her and finished his coffee. Property again, always property. The old lodge, the lighthouse, the abandoned mill. Church records, solicitors, whatever Rupert had come to Lockdown to acquire, it was worth far more than a simple festival contract. Instead of walking to the police station, Hamish turned uphill toward the cottage of old Morag Fraser. Morag was 90 if she was a day. She had lived in Lockdown longer than anyone else. More importantly, she remembered everything. He found her feeding hens. "They're ungrateful creatures," she announced before he had spoken. "The hens? No." She pointed toward the village. "People." Hamish leaned comfortably against the gate. "I've a question. I've an answer. I've not asked it yet. You will." She scattered another handful of grain. "What do you know about the Macpherson Lodge?" Morag stopped moving. For the first time that morning, she looked genuinely thoughtful. "So." She brushed flour from her apron. "Someone's asking about that place again." "You've heard?" "I hear everything." Hamish believed her. The lodge belonged to the Macpherson family for generations. Aye. But they didn't build it. No? She shook her head. It was built on older land. What sort of land? Morag lowered her voice. Land that was divided after a court case. When? Oh. She waved a hand vaguely. Nearly 100 years ago. What was the dispute? I don't rightly remember, but I do remember this. She fixed Hamish with surprisingly sharp eyes. The papers disappeared. What papers? The ones saying who owned what. Hamish felt a faint stirring of interest. Disappeared. Burned, some said. Stolen, said others. And what do you think? Morag smiled. I think they were hidden. Where? If I knew that, young Hamish. She chuckled softly. I'd have sold them years ago. As Hamish walked back toward the village, Towser suddenly veered off the path and began sniffing around the edge of an overgrown stone wall. What have ye found? The dog pawed at the grass. Something white protruded beneath a clump of nettles. Hamish bent down. Not paper. An envelope. Damp but intact. It had clearly been dropped recently. Across the front, in neat handwriting, appeared the words, Mrs. Evelyn Mercer. No stamp. No address. Inside was a folded note. Hamish hesitated only long enough to consider whether he ought to open it. Then he did. The message was brief. Meet me at the lodge after the fireworks. Come alone. Everything can still be put right. Bring the map. No signature, but it hardly needed one. The fireworks had ended just before Rupert's death. The lodge, not the lighthouse. Hamish folded the note carefully. Someone had lied. Perhaps Rupert. Perhaps Evelyn. Perhaps both. He had scarcely returned to the police station when Blair's voice erupted from inside. What do you mean he's disappeared? Hamish entered quietly. Blair was glaring at one of his detectives. Malcolm's solicitor arrived. So, the prisoner requested legal advice, and, when we went to fetch him, the detective swallowed. His cell was empty. Blair looked as though he might explode. Empty? The window bars had been sawn. Sawn? During the night. Blair rounded on Hamish. This is your fault. You should have warned us. I didn't know he was planning to leave. Blair ignored the remark. Get out there. I was about to. Find him. Hamish nodded agreeably. I'll see what I can do. As he stepped outside, Elspeth caught up with him. You don't believe Malcolm escaped on his own? No. Why not? Hamish looked back toward the station. Because Malcolm's no fool. And, if he were innocent, he'd stay. Aye. She frowned. So why run? Hamish unfolded the damp note from his pocket and handed it to her. She read it twice. The map? That's the interesting part. You think Rupert found something? I think Rupert believed something was hidden. And now? Hamish looked toward the lonely silhouette of the Macpherson Lodge standing against the hillside. Now it seemed that abandoned house had become the center of everything. Rupert had arranged a meeting there. Someone had wanted a map. Property records had vanished decades earlier. And the one man Blair considered guilty had escaped custody within hours of the murder. Too many people were now moving toward the same destination. Hamish had learned long ago that when enough people began searching for the same secret, someone usually ended up dead. Looking up at the silent lodge, he found himself hoping they were not already too late. Hamish left the police station without announcing where he was going. Experience had taught him that if Blair knew his destination, Blair would arrive first, shout at everyone present, arrest the least cooperative person, and frighten away whatever truth had been quietly waiting to be discovered. Towser trotted beside him as they climbed the winding track toward the Macpherson Lodge. The abandoned house stood on a rise overlooking Loch Dhu, its grey stone walls streaked with moss and its windows staring blankly across the loch. Heather had crept over the old carriage drive, and young birch trees had begun reclaiming what had once been a carefully tended garden. The place had the lonely dignity common to neglected Highland buildings. It looked forgotten. Hamish doubted it had been. The front door was secured with a rusted chain, but the side entrance hung slightly open. Someone had been there recently. Towser sniffed the threshold before slipping inside. The entrance hall smelled of damp plaster, old timber and peat soot. Dust coated the floor, except for a narrow trail of fresh footprints leading toward the library. Hamish followed them without haste. The library was little more than 4 walls lined with empty shelves. Rain had stained the ceiling, and one corner had partially collapsed years before. Yet someone had disturbed the room. Books lay scattered across the floor. Several shelves had been pulled away from the wall. An old writing desk had every drawer emptied onto the floorboards. Not vandalism. Searching. Hamish crouched beside the desk. Most people searching in a hurry left disorder. Whoever had searched here had left something else. Patience. The drawers had been removed carefully, the papers stacked rather than thrown. Someone had been looking for one specific thing. Towser barked once from the fireplace. "What have you found?" Behind the crumbling hearthstone, partly hidden beneath loose mortar, lay an iron box scarcely larger than a biscuit tin. Its lid stood open, empty. Hamish ran a finger through the dust inside. Recently emptied. Very recently. So. He sat back on his heels. "We've arrived after someone else." A voice behind him answered quietly. "Only by a few minutes." Hamish turned. Evelyn Mercer stood in the doorway. She looked exhausted. Her cream coat was torn near one shoulder, and there were dark circles beneath her eyes, as though sleep had become an impossible luxury. Towser walked over to her, without hesitation. She absent-mindedly stroked his head. "I thought you might come here," she said. "I hoped you would." She gave a weary smile. "You're different from the other policemen. They tell me that often. You actually listen." Hamish remained silent. After a moment, Evelyn sighed. "I suppose it's time." "For what?" "For telling someone the truth." She crossed to the dusty window overlooking the lock. "My husband died 8 years ago." Hamish waited. "His name was Daniel Mercer. I gathered. He and Rupert weren't merely business associates. No? They were cousins. Interesting. Very interesting. They inherited something together," Evelyn continued. "Not money. What then?" She looked toward the abandoned fireplace. "A claim." Hamish said nothing. "Long ago," she went on, "the Macpherson estate was divided after a legal dispute. Most people believed all the documents had been destroyed, but they weren't." She shook her head. "My husband discovered references to a survey map." "The map?" "Yes. The one from the note." She nodded. "It identified land boundaries no one remembered. And Rupert wanted it. He became obsessed." "Why?" "Because whoever possessed that map could establish ownership of several abandoned properties. The lodge, yes. The mill, yes. The lighthouse." She nodded once more. "They're all connected." Hamish slowly looked around the library. So Rupert wasn't organizing a festival. The festival was simply an excuse to search without attracting attention. Exactly. Hamish thought back over the previous days. Rupert questioning villagers about old buildings, church records, property deeds, the solicitor's letters. Everything suddenly fitted together with quiet, satisfying precision. Except, why meet here after the fireworks? Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. "Because Rupert telephoned me. He said he'd found the box, the iron box." "Yes. He wanted to divide whatever was inside. And I refused. You came anyway." "I arrived late." "How late?" She swallowed. 10 minutes. "What happened?" "The box was already open." "Rupert?" "He was gone." "You didn't see him?" "No." "You went to the lighthouse afterward." She looked surprised. "How did you know?" "I've been asking questions." She managed another faint smile. "I thought perhaps he'd gone there. But he hadn't." "No." Hamish nodded thoughtfully. Her account rang true. Not because it was dramatic, because it explained things she had no reason to invent. Still, one question remained. Who else knew about the map? Evelyn's expression changed. "Malcolm." He invested money in Rupert's search. So he had a motive too. Perhaps. She hesitated. But Malcolm never cared about history. What did he care about? The money. Footsteps suddenly echoed through the hall. Heavy. Hurried. Towser growled. Hamish quietly motioned Evelyn behind him. The footsteps stopped outside the library. Then came the unmistakable bellow of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. "Macbeth." Hamish closed his eyes for a brief moment. Perfect timing. Blair stormed into the room accompanied by 2 detectives, his face lit with triumph. "I knew I'd find you interfering." "Morning, Blair." Blair jabbed a finger toward Evelyn. "There she is." Evelyn stiffened. "I've been looking for you." "I've done nothing." "We'll decide that." He turned to his detectives. "Arrest her." Hamish spoke calmly. "On what charge?" "Conspiracy." "To do what?" "Something criminal." One detective shifted awkwardly. Blair ignored him. "She's been lying. So has half the village. I've evidence." "What evidence?" Blair reached dramatically into his coat pocket and produced a folded document. "We found this in Malcolm's abandoned car." He unfolded it with a flourish. It was an old survey map, yellowed with age, covered in faded ink markings. Every property Rupert had asked about was circled in red. Blair smiled broadly. "There." He looked immensely pleased with himself. "The motive." Hamish studied the map without touching it. Blair frowned. "What does HM mean?" "It means I'm thinking." "Well, stop." "I'd rather not." Blair folded the map again. Malcolm stole this. Maybe. He murdered Rupert. Maybe. He helped this woman hide the evidence. Maybe. Blair threw up his hands. What more do you want? Hamish looked slowly around the silent library. The iron box. What about it? It was opened. So, if the map was inside, Blair nodded impatiently. Then why? Hamish asked quietly. Is there almost no dust inside the box? Silence filled the room. Even Blair stopped speaking. Hamish walked over to the fireplace. He pointed to the clean interior. That box has been opened recently. So, but not often. He looked directly at Blair. If the map had been hidden there for decades. He paused. Where are the dust marks that paper leaves behind? Blair stared blankly. Hamish continued. The map's old. Aye. The box is old. Aye. But they haven't been together very long. Realization slowly spread across Evelyn's face. You mean? Hamish nodded. The map wasn't hidden in this box. He turned back toward Blair. Someone wanted us to believe it was. For the first time since arriving in Lockdow, Blair looked uncertain. The survey map, which had seemed to solve everything only moments before, had suddenly become something else entirely. Not the answer. Another carefully planted clue. And Hamish had the uncomfortable feeling that whoever had planted it was still several moves ahead. Blair's uncertainty lasted only a moment. Then, as always, certainty returned without the inconvenience of thought. Rubbish, he barked. You're overcomplicating a simple case. Hamish looked at the empty iron box once more. I usually find murder is what complicates things. Blair ignored him. Take Miss Mercer to the station. Before either detective could move, Evelyn quietly said, I won't run. Something in her voice made even Blair hesitate. Hamish watched her closely. She was frightened. But she wasn't frightened of arrest. She was frightened that someone else would reach something, or someone, before he did. That feeling settled in the back of Hamish's mind like a pebble dropped into still water. He thanked Blair pleasantly for showing him the survey map, wished everyone a good afternoon, and walked out of the lodge with Towser padding behind him. Blair shouted after him. Where do you think you're going? Home. You can't go home. I've not been there all day. You've got a murder to solve. Hamish looked over his shoulder. I know. Then he continued down the hill. Blair muttered something unprintable. Hamish did go home. He lit the stove. Put on the kettle. Fed Towser. Stirred a pot of stew that had been waiting since the previous evening. Anyone watching through the window would have sworn the village constable had abandoned the investigation altogether. That was precisely the impression Hamish wished to create. While the stew simmered, he spread a rough sketch of Lockdow across the kitchen table. Not a proper map, just one he had drawn himself over the years. He marked the places Rupert had visited. The lighthouse, the lodge, the abandoned mill, the church, the harbour. He sat back. It still looked wrong. Then Towser wandered over carrying the single pearl button Hamish had placed on the mantel the night before. The dog dropped it onto the map. It landed beside the hotel. Hamish smiled slowly. Good lad. He had been thinking about land. Everyone had. But murder wasn't committed over land. It was committed over people. The map explained why Rupert had come to Lockdow. It did not explain why he had died beneath the festival stage. Unless, he suddenly remembered Rupert grabbing Evelyn's wrist, the torn button, the missing shoe placed later beneath the rubbish bin, the clump of fresh heather in Rupert's hand. Someone had not merely killed Rupert. Someone had tried to rewrite what happened afterward. And only one person had been quietly present at every stage of the festival without attracting notice. Not Malcolm. Not Evelyn. Someone everybody trusted. Someone almost invisible. Mrs. Wellington had been too busy. Angus too outspoken. Jessie too curious. His thoughts settled instead upon another familiar face. The festival coordinator's local assistant, Fiona Mackenzie. Young, efficient, helpful. She had carried clipboards, held spare keys to the hotel, moved freely between every festival site. She had been the one who insisted on checking the stage after the fireworks. No one had questioned why. No one had questioned her at all. Hamish did not march to her cottage. He never cared for dramatic accusations. Instead, he paid several casual visits around the village. He mentioned to Mrs. Wellington that Blair had recovered the real property documents. He remarked to Jessie that the missing papers would soon prove exactly who had opened the iron box. To Archie on the pier he quietly observed that hidden compartments often escaped amateur searches. By evening, the rumor had spread exactly where Hamish intended. There was no hidden treasure. There was something better. Evidence. Towser and Hamish waited beside the abandoned mill as darkness settled over the glen. If I'm wrong, Hamish said quietly, I'll be eating cold stew. Towser wagged his tail. An hour passed. Only the wind disturbed the heather. Then, a lantern appeared on the path. One figure, walking quickly, frequently looking behind. Hamish remained hidden inside the ruined mill. The figure entered carrying a small spade. Not searching, returning. She crossed directly to a loose floorstone near the old water wheel. Knelt, lifted it, reached inside. Hamish stepped into the lantern light. Evening, Fiona. She froze. For one brief second she considered running. Then she saw Towser blocking the doorway. The small canvas bundle slipped from her hands. Inside lay the genuine property deeds, several letters, Rupert's solicitor's papers, and the other half of the torn note from the lighthouse. Fiona closed her eyes. So, she whispered. You knew, I suspected. How? Hamish looked at the bundle. You were too tidy. She frowned. I don't understand. You kept cleaning Rupert's mistakes. The shoe, the map, the papers. He picked up the canvas bundle. You nearly managed it. She laughed bitterly. Nearly. For several moments neither spoke. Finally Fiona sat heavily upon an old timber beam. I never meant to kill him. Hamish nodded. I thought as much. He lied to everyone. I noticed. He promised I'd become a partner. She laughed again, though there was little humor left in it. I worked for years. Organized everything. Found the old estate records. Tracked the survey map. And then? He decided he didn't need me anymore. She looked toward the dark doorway. He intended to leave me with nothing. Hamish listened. No interruptions. People often confessed best when allowed to hear themselves. He arranged to meet Evelyn at the lodge. I found the iron box first. It was empty. I confronted him after the fireworks beneath the stage. Her hands began to tremble. He laughed. Said I'd been useful. Nothing more. She swallowed. I slapped him. He pushed me. I fell. My coat caught. The button. She nodded. I picked up a length of timber. Her voice broke. I only wanted him to stop laughing. Silence filled the ruined mill. When he fell, I thought he was unconscious. I dragged him beneath the stage. The tide was coming in. I panicked. The shoe came off, so I put it back later. And the map. I found it afterwards in Rupert's briefcase. I hid the real papers. I planted the map so Blair would stop looking. Hamish sighed quietly. So much work. She looked at him with exhausted eyes. It almost worked. It almost did. Blair arrived 20 minutes later. Red-faced and breathless after following one of Hamish's carefully arranged rumors, he burst into the mill. What have we got? Hamish gestured toward Fiona, who made no attempt to resist. Your murderer. Blair blinked. What? She's confessed. Blair looked astonished, then suspicious. How did you manage that? Hamish shrugged. We talked. You talked? I. Blair clearly found this method deeply unconventional. He straightened his jacket importantly. Very good. I'll take charge. I thought you might. The following week, newspapers across Scotland praised Detective Chief Inspector Blair for solving the Heather Festival murder with determined leadership. Blair happily accepted every compliment. He never once mentioned Hamish Macbeth. Hamish preferred it that way. The superintendent congratulated Blair. Promotion was discussed. For Blair. Not Hamish. Exactly as planned, Loch Dubh slowly returned to itself. The festival bunting came down. Visitors departed. The abandoned stage was dismantled. Children once again chased gulls along the harbour, as though murder had merely been another spell of bad weather. Mrs. Wellington declared the next Heather Festival would be organised by local people and absolutely no one from Surrey. No one argued. Evelyn Mercer chose to donate the disputed land records to the local archives, ending the century-old uncertainty over the abandoned properties. Malcolm, cleared of all suspicion, sold his share of the business and quietly disappeared south, declaring he had seen enough of both festivals and business partners to last a lifetime. One crisp autumn evening, Hamish sat outside his croft with a mug of strong coffee warming his hands. Towser lay contentedly at his feet. The wind carried the scent of peat smoke across the loch. Clouds drifted lazily over the mountains. At last, everything was peaceful again. Hamish took a slow sip of coffee. Towser looked up expectantly. No, Hamish said. You've had enough sausage for one day. The dog sighed with theatrical disappointment. Hamish smiled. A village at peace. A full pot of stew waiting on the stove. No promotion. No transfer to Strathbane. No speeches. No newspaper interviews. As far as the rest of Scotland was concerned, Detective Chief Inspector Blair had solved another difficult case. That suited Hamish Macbeth perfectly. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the quiet murmur of the lock. Peace, he reflected, was a rare thing. It was worth protecting, even if nobody ever knew who had truly protected it.